Have you heard about the two most famous fortune tellers in history? Nostradamus and Baba Vanga saw things that nobody else could see. Their words have made people wonder for hundreds of years. Nostradamus lived in France 500 years ago. He wrote strange poems that people say told about the French Revolution, World War II, and even modern events. Some think he knew about things that would happen hundreds of years after his death. Then there's Baba Vanga, the blind woman from Bulgaria, who died in 1996. People came from all over the world to ask her what would happen in their future. Many say she knew about September 11th and other big world events before they happened. Even presidents and world leaders wanted to know what she had to say. Today, we're going to look at their most amazing predictions. Some of these predictions are scary, some are surprising, and some might still come true. Were they really able to see the future? Or did people just make their words fit whatever happened later? What's really interesting is that both of them made predictions about things that might happen in our time, right now, today. And some of their predictions for the next few years will make you think twice about what's possible. Stay with us to hear the strangest and most accurate predictions these two ever made. And wait until you hear what they said would happen next. Both Nostradamus and Baba Vanga made interesting predictions about space travel and Mars. Their words about space have caught people's attention, especially now when we see companies planning Mars missions. Baba Vanga said humans would build homes on Mars by 2025. She talked about rich people being the first ones to move there, making Mars a place for those who could pay for space travel. Now we see Elon Musk and SpaceX working hard to make Mars travel real, just as she predicted. Nostradamus wrote about red soil becoming man's new home. People think he meant Mars, since Mars is known as the red planet. He said humans would face many problems trying to live there, but would find ways to grow food in special buildings. This matches what scientists are planning now. They want to build special greenhouses on Mars where astronauts can grow their own food. Both seers talked about a rich man who would lead the way to Mars. Nostradamus mentioned a merchant prince who would build iron birds to carry people to new worlds. Many think this describes Elon Musk, who started as a businessman and now runs SpaceX, making rockets to go to Mars. Baba Vanga said space travel would become normal by 2028. She predicted regular people would be able to visit space stations, much like how we see rich tourists going to space now. She also warned about problems with early Mars missions, saying some people would get sick from the different air and gravity. The predictions mentioned strange things happening in space. Nostradamus wrote about celestial fire that would worry Earth's people. Some think this might be about solar flares or asteroids coming close to Earth. He said these space events would make humans work harder to protect Earth and build more space stations. Baba Vanga predicted that humans would find something surprising on Mars, signs that people lived there long ago. She said this discovery would change how we think about human history. Now, NASA's Mars rovers are looking for signs of ancient life, though they haven't found any yet. Both prophets said space exploration would bring countries together. They predicted that old enemies would work together to build space stations and Mars bases. We can see this happening now. Different countries share the International Space Station, even when they disagree about other things. The seers warned about problems with Mars colonies. They said the first settlements would face dangerous storms and equipment breaking down. But they also said humans would learn from these problems and make better space homes. Nostradamus wrote about gardens in glass houses, which sounds like the indoor farms scientists want to build on Mars. They talked about new inventions for space travel, too. Baba Vanga mentioned special suits that would protect people from space radiation, and Nostradamus wrote about machines that would make air for humans to breathe on Mars. Scientists are working on both these things right now. The predictions also mention finding valuable things in space. They said humans would mine asteroids and other planets for precious metals and new materials. Today, many companies are planning asteroid mining missions, hoping to find valuable resources in space. Some of their space predictions are about big changes in how we live. They said that by 2050, many people would work in space, fixing satellites and building new space stations. They predicted space tourism would become common, with hotels in orbit around Earth and tours to see the moon up close. Nostradamus and Baba Vanga both made surprising predictions about the British royal family. Their words about King Charles III and the future of the monarchy have made many people pay attention, especially after Queen Elizabeth II's death. Baba Vanga said something that worried many people. She predicted King Charles III would have a short time as king. She said health problems would make things difficult for him. She also said his time as king would bring big changes to how the royal family works. Nostradamus wrote about a king of the islands who would face many problems during his rule. He said this king would come to power when he was already old and would have trouble keeping everyone happy. Many think he was talking about Charles, who became king at age 73. Both seers talked about Prince William becoming king sooner than expected. They said he would do things differently from the old ways. Baba Vanga predicted William would try to make the monarchy more modern and closer to regular people. She said he would work to fix the royal family's image after some difficult times. The predictions mention Prince Harry, too. Nostradamus wrote about a young prince who would leave his family and live far away. This matches what happened when Harry moved to America. Both seers said this prince would keep causing problems for the royal family, but would also help change how people think about royalty. Baba Vanga made a strong prediction about the monarchy's future. She said, by 2030, the British royal family would be very different from what we know today. She talked about them losing many of their old powers and traditions, saying they would have to change to stay important to people. Nostradamus warned about money problems for the royal family. He said they would need to be more careful with how they spend money because people would start questioning why they need so much. This fits with today's discussions about how much the monarchy costs taxpayers. Both prophets said something interesting about the royal children, George, Charlotte, and Louis. They predicted these young royals would grow up in a very different world and would help create a new kind of monarchy. Baba Vanga said Princess Charlotte would become especially important in changing how people see the royal family. The predictions talk about royal homes changing too. They said some palaces would be open to the public, while others would be used for different things. Nostradamus wrote about ancient halls becoming places for common folk, which might mean more royal buildings being used for public purposes. They also predicted changes in how the Commonwealth works. Both seers said more countries would leave the Commonwealth during Charles's time as king. They warned this would make some people question if the monarchy is still needed in modern times. The seers mentioned protests and problems the royals would face. They said young people would start asking why Britain still needs a monarchy, but they also said the royal family would find new ways to show they're useful to society, like helping with environmental causes and charity work. Some of their predictions talk about big royal events that would bring good news during hard times. They said these celebrations would help remind people why they care about the royal family. However, they warned that the monarchy would need to keep changing and adapting to stay meaningful to new generations. Both Nostradamus and Baba Vanga made serious predictions about problems with the environment and society. Their words about natural disasters, food problems, and social troubles seem to match many things happening today. Baba Vanga warned about big changes in weather that would hurt food growing. She said many farms would stop working because of too much heat and not enough rain. She predicted that by 2025, many countries would have trouble growing enough food for their people. Now we see farmers having problems because of unusual weather and food prices going up in stores. Nostradamus wrote about times when rain would fall in strange ways, too much in some places and none in others. He said this would make it hard to grow food in places that used to be good for farming. He also talked about warm winters and hot summers that would confuse plants and animals. We can see this happening now, with crops failing, because seasons don't come at the right times anymore. Both seers said water would become a big problem. They predicted some cities would run out of clean water, while others would have too much water from floods. Baba Vanga said people would fight over water in many places, and some would have to leave their homes to find places with enough water to live. The predictions talk about food becoming very expensive. They said regular people would have trouble buying enough food, and this would make them angry at their leaders. Nostradamus wrote about empty stores and people waiting in long lines for food, something we've started seeing in some countries. They warned about cities having big problems. Baba Vanga said some cities near oceans would flood so much that people would have to leave them behind. Nostradamus predicted that others would become too hot to live in during summer, forcing people to move to cooler places. Both prophets said these problems would make people angry and scared. They predicted protests and fights breaking out in cities when food and water become hard to find. They said some governments would fall apart because they couldn't help their people get what they needed to live. The predictions mentioned problems with electricity, too. They said power would stop working in many places because of storms and heat. Without electricity, they warned that cities would have trouble keeping food fresh and helping sick people in hospitals. They talked about rich people building special safe places to live, while poor people would have to deal with the worst problems. Baba Vanga said some people would live in buildings that make their own food and clean air, while others would struggle to survive outside. Both seers predicted that these problems would force people to change how they live. They said humans would need to learn to use less water, grow food in new ways, and live without many things they're used to having. Nostradamus wrote about people going back to simpler ways of living, growing their own food and sharing with neighbors. The predictions include warnings about new kinds of sicknesses spreading when people move away from trouble areas. They said these movements would cause problems in places where people go looking for safer homes, leading to arguments between old residents and newcomers. Their words about nature are scary, too. They predicted animals and plants would start dying out faster, and some places would become so hot or dry that nothing could live there anymore. But they also said humans would find new ways to save some animals and plants by moving them to safer places. Both Nostradamus and Baba Vanga made serious predictions about problems with the environment and society. Their words about natural disasters, food problems, and social troubles seem to match many things happening today. Baba Vanga warned about big changes in weather that would hurt food growing. She said many farms would stop working because of too much heat and not enough rain. She predicted that by 2025, many countries would have trouble growing enough food for their people. Now we see farmers having problems because of unusual weather and food prices going up in stores. Nostradamus wrote about times when rain would fall in strange ways, too much in some places and none in others. He said this would make it hard to grow food in places that used to be good for farming. He also talked about warm winters and hot summers that would confuse plants and animals. We can see this happening now, with crops failing, because seasons don't come at the right times anymore. Both seers said water would become a big problem. They predicted some cities would run out of clean water, while others would have too much water from floods. Baba Vanga said people would fight over water in many places, and some would have to leave their homes to find places with enough water to live. The predictions talk about food becoming very expensive. They said regular people would have trouble buying enough food, and this would make them angry at their leaders. Nostradamus wrote about empty stores and people waiting in long lines for food, something we've started seeing in some countries. They warned about cities having big problems. Baba Vanga said some cities near oceans would flood so much that people would have to leave them behind. Nostradamus predicted that others would become too hot to live in during summer, forcing people to move to cooler places. Both prophets said these problems would make people angry and scared. They predicted protests and fights breaking out in cities when food and water become hard to find. They said some governments would fall apart because they couldn't help their people get what they needed to live. The predictions mentioned problems with electricity, too. They said power would stop working in many places because of storms and heat. Without electricity, they warned that cities would have trouble keeping food fresh and helping sick people in hospitals. They talked about rich people building special safe places to live, while poor people would have to deal with the worst problems. Baba Vanga said some people would live in buildings that make their own food and clean air, while others would struggle to survive outside. Both seers predicted that these problems would force people to change how they live. They said humans would need to learn to use less water, grow food in new ways, and live without many things they're used to having. Nostradamus wrote about people going back to simpler ways of living, growing their own food and sharing with neighbors. The predictions include warnings about new kinds of sicknesses spreading when people move away from trouble areas. They said these movements would cause problems in places where people go looking for safer homes, leading to arguments between old residents and newcomers. Their words about nature are scary, too. They predicted animals and plants would start dying out faster, and some places would become so hot or dry that nothing could live there anymore. But they also said humans would find new ways to save some animals and plants by moving them to safer places. Baba Vanga's words have made many people nervous about what might happen in 2025. The blind seer from Bulgaria said something very serious about this time. She warned that humans might face their biggest challenge ever. She talked about a time when Earth would be in danger and people would need to fight hard to survive. What's really strange is how she talked about Europe changing forever. She said many people would leave their homes, and some places would become empty. When she made these predictions years ago, nobody thought much about them. But now, with what's happening between Russia and Ukraine, people are looking at her words differently. She specifically mentioned that a great European country would face hard times and lose many people. Some think she was talking about Ukraine. The war that started in 2022 has already made millions of people leave their homes. Towns and cities that were once full of life are now quiet and empty, just like she described, but there's more to what Baba Vanga said. She talked about how Russia would become very powerful and would try to control many other countries. She warned that Russia would want to be Lord of the world. When we look at what's happening now, with Russia trying to take parts of Ukraine and threatening other countries, her words seem to match up with today's news. The scariest part of her predictions is about a new kind of weapon. She said someone would use a weapon that could hurt many people at once. Some people think this might be about nuclear weapons or other dangerous weapons that countries have today. With all the fighting going on and countries threatening each other, this prediction makes many people worried. She also said something would happen that would change how countries work together. She talked about new groups of countries forming, with some becoming friends and others becoming enemies. We can see this happening now. Countries are picking sides, making new agreements, and breaking old ones. One of her strangest predictions was about weather and nature. She said Europe would face unusual weather that would cause problems for farmers and food supplies. In recent years, we've seen more floods, heat waves and storms than ever before. These weather problems have already started affecting how much food Europe can grow. Looking at all these predictions together makes many people take Baba Vanga's words seriously. Even though she died in 1996, the things she talked about seem to fit with what's happening in the world right now. Whether you believe in prophecies or not, it's hard to ignore how close some of her predictions have come to reality. The next few years will show us if her most serious predictions about 2025 come true. Many hope she was wrong about the biggest threats she saw coming, but her track record of correct predictions has made even skeptics pay attention to what she said about our near future. What's amazing about Nostradamus is how his predictions from 500 years ago seem to match what Baba Vanga said. He wrote about big fights breaking out in Europe that would change everything. His words describe armies moving across borders and cities being destroyed, things we're seeing in the news today. In his famous Book of Prophecies, Nostradamus wrote about a great war that would start in Europe. He said it would begin when a powerful country attacks its neighbor, and other countries would have to choose sides. The way he described it sounds a lot like what's happening with Russia and Ukraine right now. Nostradamus was very specific about Russia in his predictions. He called it the blue country and said it would try to become more powerful than ever before. He warned that this country would make other nations afraid and cause problems that would last for years. When we look at how Russia is acting today, threatening other countries and trying to take control, it fits with what he wrote centuries ago. One of his most worrying predictions was about a new sickness that would spread around the world. He said it would come after a time of peace and catch everyone by surprise. The disease would make many people sick and change how we live our daily lives. Some people think he might have been talking about COVID-19, but others worry he meant something that hasn't happened yet. Nostradamus also wrote about strange weather patterns and natural disasters happening all at once. He said floods, droughts, and storms would hit different parts of Europe in ways nobody had seen before. These unusual weather events would make it hard for farmers to grow food, leading to shortages in many countries. Looking at the news today, we can see these kinds of weather problems happening more and more. He mentioned something very specific about leaders fighting over resources. In his writings, he talked about countries arguing about energy supplies and trying to control them. This matches what's happening now with Russia, Europe, and their arguments about oil and gas supplies. The French prophet wrote about a time when money would lose its value and people would have trouble buying basic things. He said prices would go up so much that regular people wouldn't be able to afford what they need. With inflation causing problems in many countries right now, this prediction seems to be coming true too. One of the scariest things Nostradamus wrote about was a new kind of weapon that would cause destruction like never before. He described it as something that could burn cities and poison the land for years. Many people think he was talking about nuclear weapons, which makes his warnings even more serious today. When we put Nostradamus's predictions next to what Baba Vanga said, we see many similar warnings. Both talked about big changes in Europe, problems with Russia, and dangerous new weapons. They both warned about weather changes and food problems too. Even though they lived hundreds of years apart, they seemed to see the same threats coming in our time. Both Nostradamus and Baba Vanga made some incredible predictions about aliens coming to Earth. What's really interesting is that they both said these beings would show up during our time. They didn't talk about little green men or scary monsters. Instead, they described smart, advanced beings who might want to help us. Baba Vanga was very clear about this. She said humans would have their first real meeting with aliens, and it wouldn't be what most people expect. She described these beings as looking different from us, but having amazing technology and wisdom. According to her, they wouldn't come to hurt us. They'd want to share their knowledge and help solve some of Earth's biggest problems. The blind prophet said these aliens would first make contact with world leaders. She explained that they would show up in a way that nobody could deny or explain away. No more blurry videos or strange lights in the sky. This would be clear proof that we're not alone in the universe. She even said they might have been watching us for a long time, waiting for the right moment to say hello. Nostradamus wrote about this too, in his own mysterious way. In his poems, he talked about beings from beyond the stars, coming to Earth during a time when humans would be facing big troubles. He said these visitors would bring new ways to make energy and grow food, exactly the kind of help we might need with today's climate and energy problems. Both seers agreed on something surprising. These aliens would be more spiritual than we expect. They wouldn't just bring fancy machines and new technology. Instead, they'd teach us about the universe in ways that would change how we think about everything. They'd show us that there's more to life than what we can see and touch. According to their predictions, these beings would know things about nature and science that would seem like magic to us. But they'd be patient teachers, showing us how to use their knowledge safely. They wouldn't just give us all their technology at once. They'd help us grow ready for it first. One of the most hopeful parts of these predictions is about unity. Both Nostradamus and Baba Vanga said that meeting aliens would bring humans together in new ways. Countries that used to fight would start working together. People would start caring more about saving Earth and less about fighting each other. The predictions also talk about how these beings would help us clean up our planet. They'd show us new ways to fix pollution, stop climate change, and make clean energy. Some of their ideas would be so different from anything we've tried before that they'd seem impossible at first. But they'd work better than anything we've ever made. But there's a warning too. Both prophets said we'd need to be ready to accept this help. If we're too scared or stubborn to trust these visitors, we might miss out on their help when we need it most. They said some people would be excited about the aliens, while others would be afraid or angry about them coming here. Both Baba Vanga and Nostradamus made some startling predictions about political events that could happen soon. Their words about Russia's leader are particularly attention-grabbing. Baba Vanga said someone close to Putin would turn against him. She warned that the threat would come from inside his own circle, someone he trusts. Nostradamus wrote something similar in his own way. He talked about a powerful leader from the East who would fall because of someone he thought was loyal. He said this would happen during a time of great conflict, when many countries would be fighting. The way he described it matches what's happening with Russia right now. The predictions warn about what might happen after such an event. Both seers said it would cause huge problems around the world. Countries would struggle to handle the sudden change. Some would try to take advantage of the confusion, while others would work to keep peace. They said this time would test how well countries could work together. But there's an even more serious warning in their predictions. They both talked about a new kind of weapon that would target people's health. Nostradamus wrote about a plague of man's creation that would spread quickly. Baba Vanga mentioned something similar. She said someone would use sickness as a weapon. These predictions talk about how this weapon would be different from regular weapons. It wouldn't destroy buildings or cities, but it would make many people sick. Both seers warned that it would be hard to stop once it started spreading. They said it would force countries to work together in new ways to protect their people. They also warned about food and water becoming weapons. Nostradamus wrote about countries fighting over these basic needs. He said some leaders would try to control what other countries could get. Baba Vanga predicted that clean water would become as valuable as gold in some places. Their predictions show big changes in how countries work together. They said old friendships between nations would break, and new ones would form. Countries that used to be enemies might have to become friends to survive. Others that were always allies might end up on different sides. Money problems play a big part in these predictions, too. Both seers warned about times when regular people wouldn't be able to buy what they need. They said some countries would try to create new ways of handling money, while others would stick to old systems. This would cause arguments between nations and inside countries, too. The predictions also talk about new leaders rising up during this hard time, but they warn that not all of these new leaders would be good. Some would promise to fix everything, but would actually make things worse. They said people would need to be careful about who they trust to lead them through these changes. The term red adversary shows up in both Nostradamus and Baba Vanga's predictions. Many people think they were talking about Russia, which was known as the Red Menace during the Cold War. The color red has been tied to Russia for a long time, from their old Soviet flag to their modern Russian flag today. Nostradamus wrote about a red power that would cause fear across many nations. He said this power would grow stronger and try to bring back old ways of controlling people. His words seem to point to what Russia is doing now, trying to take back lands it once ruled and making other countries worried about what it might do next. But some people who study these predictions think there might be another meaning to the red adversary. They point to China, another powerful country that uses red as its main color. China has gotten stronger and richer in recent years, and some think it might be the real red power that both seers warned about. Baba Vanga said something interesting about this. She predicted that an old way of running countries would come back in a new form. Many think she was talking about communist ideas becoming popular again, but in a different way than before. She said these ideas would spread to places that had never tried them before. The predictions talk about how this red adversary would use money and trade to gain power, not just military strength. This matches what we see China doing today, building business connections with countries all over the world and becoming a major force in the global economy. Both seers warned about two red powers working together. They said these countries would help each other to challenge other powerful nations. Looking at how Russia and China work together today, supporting each other against Western countries, these old predictions seem to make sense. There's also a warning about these powers using new technology to control information. Nostradamus wrote about invisible chains that would bind people's minds. Today, we can see how both Russia and China use the internet and social media to spread their messages and influence what people think. The predictions also mention changes in how young people think about these old ideas. They said new generations would look at communist and socialist ideas differently from their parents and grandparents. Instead of seeing them as something scary from the past, they'd think about them in new ways. But there's hope in these predictions, too. Both seers said this time of tension wouldn't last forever. They talked about how people would learn from past mistakes and find better ways to work together. Even though the red adversary might seem powerful for a while, they said it wouldn't be able to control everything forever. Both famous seers made strong predictions about America's future. They talked about the U.S. as a giant that would face big money problems. Nostradamus wrote about a wealthy nation that would see its money lose power, while Baba Vanga warned about America's economy hitting rough times. Their words about Donald Trump are getting lots of attention. Nostradamus wrote about a controversial king who would cause problems even after leaving power. He said this leader would come back with strong support from many people, but would also make his country more divided than ever before. Baba Vanga had similar warnings. She talked about a leader who would return to power during a time when America would be splitting apart. She said this person would promise to fix everything, but might actually make things worse. Her predictions mentioned that this time would test America's strength as a nation. The predictions also warn about the U.S. dollar having problems. Both seers said something would happen to make people trust America's money less than before. They warned that other countries might start using different money systems, making the U.S. dollar weaker than it used to be. They talked about new kinds of money becoming more popular. Nostradamus wrote about invisible coins that would change how people buy things. Many think he might have been talking about digital money or cryptocurrency, which is becoming more common today. Both prophets warned about rich people gaining more control during this time. They said the gap between rich and poor people would get bigger, causing anger and protests in many cities. Baba Vanga specifically warned about people fighting in the streets over money problems. There are also predictions about America's role in the world changing. They said the U.S. would have less power over other countries than before. Some nations that used to follow America's lead would start making their own choices and finding new allies. The seers mentioned health problems affecting leaders during this time. They warned about important people getting sick or having to step down from their positions. This could cause confusion about who's in charge and make it hard for the country to make big decisions. But their predictions also talk about younger leaders stepping up with new ideas. They said these new leaders would think differently about old problems and try to fix things in ways nobody had tried before. However, they warned that people should be careful about which new leaders they trust. After looking at all these predictions from Nostradamus and Baba Vanga, we see many connections to things happening today. Their words about wars, weather changes, space threats, and world leaders make us think about our future. These two people, who lived hundreds of years apart, said many similar things. They warned us about problems with food, water, and nature. They talked about new weapons, money troubles, and changes in how countries work together. Many of their predictions match news stories we see today. Some of their scariest predictions are about natural disasters and climate change. But they also gave us hope. They said humans would find new ways to solve problems and help each other. They predicted that hard times would make people work together instead of fighting. Their words about space and technology show us how the world keeps changing. They knew humans would build amazing machines and try to live on other planets. Now we see these things starting to happen with space missions and new inventions. The predictions about the British royal family and world leaders remind us that big changes can happen anywhere, even in places with old traditions. Their words about Russia, America, and China help us understand why countries act the way they do today. When we look at all these predictions, we should remember that the future isn't set in stone. These seers showed us different paths the world might take. What happens next depends on what we do today. Many of their predictions for the next few years talk about serious problems, but they also said humans would find answers if they worked together. They believed people would learn from hard times and make better choices. Right now, we're living in the time when many of their predictions might come true. Some already have. Others might happen soon, or might turn out differently. The best thing we can do is pay attention to what's happening in the world and think carefully about how we can help make things better. These predictions from the past can help us understand today's problems better. They show us that people have always worried about the future, but have also always found ways to survive and grow stronger. What matters most is how we use this knowledge to make good choices for tomorrow. Don't miss out. Hit subscribe now to find out what these famous seers said about our future.